Okay, great. Let's get started then. The major call coming out of this presentation is really that China is just not fit for the coming Fed normalization that we expect over the next 18 months. And the main implications of that in terms of asset allocation is that the renminbi is probably going to step out of this this profile that we've seen over the past few years, where we see a bit of a depreciation, and then the PBOC steps back and re-anchors expectations, and we get a bit of sideways movement, and then a step down again, and then sideways movement. The main implication of this call that China really is not capable of withstanding the rise in Fed rates without kind of serious repercussions for its own economy is this. The renminbi is likely to now move into a sharper depreciation. So the agenda for today, I want to look at what's happened in the party congress, the main takeaways that we have from that, and then I want to take a big step back and look at where China is, because we're still kind of we've only just really met each other, so I want to give you that backstory. From there, I'm going to look at where growth is in China at the moment, and why is growth on our estimates significantly lower than what the authorities are showing. And from there, I want to look at what the policy response is going to be in the next kind of 18 months or so in the context of that normalization of Fed policy. So to start with, the party congress, there's been a few good themes coming out of the congress so far, with Xi Jinping's speech opening the congress last Wednesday, and there's really two main things that have come out for that for me. One is his intention, and the second is the means of achieving that. So the intention is clear, that he sees the next few years to 2020 as critical in achieving this, as he calls it, the Xiaokang Hui, the society which meets the basic needs of all of its populace. Now, what does he mean by that? And he went on from that statement to list many different facets of what that could possibly entail, and the economy was really just one part of that. GDP was really just one part of that, and critically, the environment was very highly emphasized as important to achieving that type of society. From these statements and from the broader tone of the Congress, and from the kind of the trailers to the Congress that we've had over the course of this year, it's becoming clear that the social contract in China has actually changed quite significantly. In the past couple of decades, it was basically just, we are the Chinese Communist Party, we will provide faster GDP growth for you, we will provide rising incomes, and that was it, and that was acceptable. It's now become clear that the cost of that very fast GDP growth, that very fast investment-led GDP growth, which a lot of it was actually wasteful investment, the cost of that has been environmental degradation, and that's actually become the primary, or at least as important as GDP growth to the Chinese Communist Party, and also to the Chinese populace, if you look at the causes of social unrest in recent years. So the intention there is to allow the economy to continue slowing, and I think the key kind of policy call coming out of that is that maybe they will continue to publish growth targets next year, but the likelihood is, or perhaps at least a smarter way of addressing this would be to say that actually growth targets are a relic of the past. They're a relic of a previous policy of this investment-led growth that we had, and export-led growth that we had previously, and we're gonna move on from that way of approaching things, and we're not going to publish targets anymore. Whether they do that in 2018 or 2019 is a question. But the point here is that the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese policymakers, whether they post targets or not, are now willing to allow growth to run substantially below the targets that they're publishing. So that seems to be the intention. Now, what's the means of achieving that intention? Obviously, there's been a big focus on deleveraging, on the continuation of reform, the continuation of interest rate and exchange rate reform. But the key thing here that really starts to make me think that actually the intention is not going to quite get to where they want to be, is this focus on state-owned enterprises, and the focus on, as Xi Jinping put it, the stronger, better, bigger state-owned enterprises. Now, in the context of what I would see as the three main outcomes for China over the next 5 years, Xi Jinping has a much longer horizon than that, but over the next 5 years, the three main outcomes that I would see would be a benign transition to private consumption-led growth. That's obviously what they want to achieve, and that would be great for the global economy. The second outcome is a kind of a Japanning of growth, where debt continues to rise as a percentage of GDP, total debt, and particularly government debt, continues to rise as a percentage of GDP. Inflation becomes disinflation, becomes deflation over a longer period of time. And really, there's no successful rebalancing towards private consumption. You get periods in which private consumption is leading growth, but only because the rest of the economy is weaker. So that's two of the outcomes. The third outcome is your Armageddon debt explosion, and we'll get onto that when we talk about the comments from Zhou Xiaochuan and the Minsky moment, the now infamous Minsky moment comment. But between those, the first two, the private consumption and the Japanning of growth, Xi Jinping's comments on state-owned enterprises are really the key barrier for me between moving from the Japanning path, which is the path that I see the Chinese economy on at the moment, to the private consumption-led path, the active leading of the economy by private consumption. And the key there is that, okay, maybe you can improve the productivity of state-owned enterprises by plowing money into research and development and trying to make these massive entities more productive, more innovative. But a better way to do that would just be to recognize that a lot of these massive companies are just unproductive and probably shouldn't be deleveraged, and that the act of trying to deleverage them is probably going to drive growth into the ground, because they're hogging resources, they're hogging especially capital, and that capital could be used much more productively by non-government entities, rather than just being directed through either the old state-owned enterprises or through public-private partnerships into infrastructure and investment and that kind of investment. So between the first two outcomes, Xi Jinping's comments really give us the impression that they're still intending to try to deleverage these massive companies, and that's going to keep them on the Japanning path, because that's precisely what Japan did, and also Korea tried to do before it as well. So the second major theme on the financial side here was coming from the comments that we heard from Zhou Xiaochuan, Guo Shuqing, Li Gang. Clearly, deleveraging is a major concern here. But the juxtaposition of that comment on the Minsky moment for China with the other major financial theme that's coming out of this Congress, of opening up, of financial opening up, of allowing foreigners a greater share in the economy. Those two seem like pretty odd bedfellows. Effectively, they're saying we're worried that there's going to be a kind of serious, massive collapse in asset prices. We're doing our best to avoid that. We think debt's gone too far, but at the same time, could you give us your capital, because we're kind of trying to open up here and open up our banking system and our insurance sector. Those two statements don't really go that well together for my ears, at least. the point here is that the classic Minsky moment probably is actually not a threat to China. But that endeavoring to avoid it, and endeavoring to avoid that Minsky moment, they want to keep these SOEs going. They want to deleverage them, and to deleverage them, they have to run financial surpluses out of these things, and that really is a growth crusher, and that's the Japanning path there. Now, back to where we started with this, we said that China is not fit for Fed normalization, but could the Fed normalization actually have a silver lining for China in this respect? Could China get out of this, that interest rates do rise and that liquidity does dry up and capital does want to leave China, and then because of that, these firms within China that are unable to service their debts, that are unable to pay the interest on previous loans without borrowing more, they won't be able to do that anymore, and China will have to respond to that by effectively recapitalizing the banking system. Now that really entails the government getting involved, because it's clear that there isn't enough equity within China to get in there and write off the scale of bad debt that exists there. But it also entails the PBOC getting involved, because if the government was to issue the quantity of bonds that would be needed to recapitalize the banking system, if rates rise and it's not possible for these companies to continue evergreening, then there would be this kind of drying up of liquidity within China, and that would be a growth crusher as well. And while I said that the environment is now a primary concern, they don't want growth to be completely destroyed. So it means that the PBOC has to get involved as well. And if the PBOC gets involved, they're printing money, and that is what leads us to this conclusion that the renminbi really has to step out of this of the profile that we've seen over the past few years, and we'll see a much sharper depreciation. So okay, I'm going to quickly look at the bigger picture here before we get into the growth and the meat of the presentation with the slides. So the bigger picture here is that within China, you've got this massive excess of savings. And if you have an excess of savings, that means you have a deficiency of demand, because the savings is just what's left over after you've consumed out of your income. And if you have an excess of savings, you have this excess, you have an excess surplus of financial resources in that sense. Then someone somewhere has to have an excessive deficit. And previously that's been abroad. It was the subprimes before 2009 in the US, and then it was the US government, and that became politically infeasible. And then it was the EMs, and then with the taper tantrum, when people saw higher interest rates, it was clear that these guys just wouldn't be able to sustain these deficits on normal interest rates. And now what we have is that those excessive savings, those financial surpluses, have been pushed back and back and back onto China. That burden has been pushed back onto China, so that the distortions that we've seen hitherto in countries outside of China have now been created within China, and that's where you start to see pick up in debt to GDP, particularly in the corporate sector there. And in reference to Japan, we see a much bigger, much earlier increase in China's debt to GDP there. And really, it's the renminbi. It's the overvaluation of the currency in sorry, this one here is China. It's the overvaluation of the currency in real effective terms. That means that China is no longer able to export its surplus production. It's no longer able to just invest and then get rid of its products abroad. It's no longer able to send its savings abroad so that others can borrow and consume Chinese goods. So that demand deficiency is now laid bare within China, and the impact on growth has been quite substantial. I want to go back to our three outcomes, and just before we kind of get into where growth is at the moment, it's probably quite important to rule out that Armageddon, because I said that I thought they weren't they weren't actually at risk of a kind of classic Minsky moment. The key point here is that the government does still have space on its balance sheet to go into the rest of the economy, and if you like, perform the Chinese version of kind of TARP, and take the bad debts onto the government balance sheet. So our kind of best guess of Chinese bad debt as a percentage of GDP is around 25%, maybe a little bit lower than that. But let's take a kind of an upper bound on that, and say what if we just take that 25% of GDP and stick it onto the government balance sheet? Then what do we get as a percentage of GDP on a gross basis? Well, it's around 70% there. And what do we get netting out against the foreign exchange reserves? Well, it's just a little bit above 40% there. So that's high for a country of China's level of development, but it's okay, it's manageable, and critically, it's the Japanese case that tells us that it is actually manageable. Against that backdrop, okay, we're not looking for a kind of a classic Minsky moment there. We do think that they have space to get in there. But the repercussions of that would be a lower MNP, because the PBOC would have to get involved in printing money. At the same time, there has been a continuation of a rise in systemic risk here. We saw as the authorities cracked down on lending on risky practices in 2016. We saw this decline in the corporate bond market, but against that we saw a kind of a rebound in the old types of shadow banking instruments here, both undiscounted bankers' acceptance bills, and also the trust loans here in the blue line. And we've got new risks that are emerging in the household sector. So if we've got a huge part of the economy that's running a surplus, then we need another part of the economy to be running a deficit. Now, the household sector isn't running a deficit overall, but they are certainly doing a good job at reducing their surplus and increasing their debt. The point that I want to make here also is that there's, as long as China is squeezing one part of the economy, what you end up with is that money just ends up moving through the economy to another part, and causing distortions in that other part of the economy. So while we've seen the authorities in 2016 squeezing the non-bank financial institutions in the interbank market, and we've seen their borrowings come right down, that's just meant that the non-financial corporations that were using these non-bank financial institutions to borrow through the interbank market have had to borrow more on their own account, and they've also had to borrow more offshore. You can't really see it that well in this chart here, but the listed data shows that especially real estate developers and the like have turned back to the offshore markets, as they haven't been able to issue in onshore markets. And that's all going to continue to happen for as long as China keeps interest rates at this level. In short, they're not going to be able to tackle this kind of rolling ball of money that moves around within China. They're not going to be able to tackle China's addiction to borrowing without a higher interest rate, without a system-wide tightening of credit conditions through higher interest rates. So we've got enough space on the government balance sheet, but systemic risks are certainly there, and there's plenty that could touch off severe financial ruptures that would push the authorities into acting. So what does this all mean for growth? Well, the tightening that we have seen in monetary growth has been quite clear here. One of the best predictors of growth of nominal GDP in China is M1, and we've seen back when the authorities were trying to stimulate the equity market in 2015, they created a whole wodge of money, and that permeated out through the economy, and it helped to drive the rebound in property prices in 2016, and it also helped to stabilize growth in 2016 in conjunction with the quasi-fiscal policy that we saw there. But that's really a thing of the past. And excuse me. Sorry. And so this tightening that we've seen in M1 growth probably heralds a continued modest downtrend in nominal GDP growth. Now that's very important because prices have continued to rise very quickly and actually rose a little bit more quickly in Q3 than they did in Q2. The approach that we have to real GDP growth in China differs quite substantially from what you'll see in most other places, I think, in the sense that we recognize that nominal GDP, real GDP, and the deflator don't always add up. So we basically compile our own deflator. We start from the seasonally adjusted nominal GDP here, and we look at the different deflators in the economy. The PPI, we have an estimate of fixed asset investment from that, and CPI to deflate private consumption, non-food CPI to deflate government consumption, and then exports and imports are derived from a model on PPI. So the way in which we can say that growth has been below what the authorities have been saying in Q2 and Q3 here is to recognize that how fast has nominal GDP grown versus how fast have prices grown, increased. And it's clear from that calculus that growth has been lower than what the authorities have been saying, and probably in Q3 there we got growth of about 1 to 1.6%, versus in Q2 growth of about 0.8 to 1.5% quarter on quarter. Now that is substantially lower than what the authorities are saying, or it's significantly lower than what the authorities are saying. But we think that the authorities know that, going back to the point about whether they'll post new targets and whether they'll allow growth to run lower than what they're saying. The historical policy response has actually made a lot more sense in the context of these data that we're calculating on real GDP than it has in the context of the real GDP growth that the authorities publish, which has a lot less volatility in it over time. And our data is both higher in the highs and lower in the lows. So we think that the authorities are actually acting on a data set that is significantly different from what they're publishing. And the upshot for 2018 is that we think that they're going to allow growth to move substantially lower than what they would publish as a target if they're going to publish anything. And what they and if they don't target, then we don't have to worry about that. So I want to take a little bit of time here to just bore down into the activity data, because it's giving us a slightly different impression of what growth was in Q3 and how weak the economy is. And I think the main reason for that is that the GDP data has made a lot of progress in capturing the services sector, but actually still doesn't really do a great job of doing that. And it's the services sector that appears to be on a downtrend in 2017, and that makes a lot of sense because they've got a lot of cost push pressures coming through, not so much from the wage side at the moment, but through the producer price inflation that's starting to feed through. So industrial production here looks like it's holding up quite well. The rebound in September is pretty spurious on this. It looks like just a bit of a correction. But Q3 actually looks like it's a little bit slow. Quarterly growth in Q3 actually looks like it's a little bit slower than it does in Q2 here. So we've had a little bit of a slowdown in industrial production there. Exports, there's a lot of caveats to this data because we don't really have that reliable a deflator. We have to model it instead. But on our best guess, in real terms, exports are suffering quite substantially, and probably that's because of the strength of the currency. And imports also, in real terms, continue to decline in Q3 a little bit faster than the rate in Q2. What have the authorities done about this in terms of fiscal spending? Well, actually, they did seem to be spending a bit more in Q2, but interestingly, they seem to have slowed spending in Q3, and that's when the party congress is going on. So one would expect that they would have kept growth of infrastructure investment, which is a kind of a key old guard way of keeping growth up. One would expect that they would have tried to keep growth up through that old guard fashion, but it doesn't seem that they've done that. The production data also kind of corroborates that, in the sense that quarterly growth here of iron ore production was strong earlier in the year, but has actually come back in Q3 and weakened substantially. Similarly, if we look at the fixed asset investment by public entities, SOEs included, then we've continued to see a downtrend there, and that's actually pretty weak historically. So let's turn then to the services sector, and that's where we see this downtrend here, and I think that's what's actually causing our estimates of industry approach to GDP to weaken. This downtrend here that you see in the services PMI. Retail sales held up reasonably well between Q3 and Q2. The growth there has been reasonably stable, quarterly growth, but it's relatively weak by historical standards. It's weak, very weak by historical standards if we extend this chart back here. And the reason for that is that even though the manufacturing sector has done quite well over the past few quarters, we'll see that in the next set of slides. The productivity drive is still very much ongoing, so we haven't made it back to the employment sub-index of the Tyson manufacturing PMI has not actually made it back to 50. So it's still a weak labor market there from an employment sense. And the wage data is kind of infamously bad in China, but we can get an idea of it by what's happening to margins in manufacturing, and also in downstream manufacturing, which is a bigger employer now, and in services, because we've had this massive increase in prices, producer prices recently, but it's been very much kind of commodity driven, and that's kind of started to feed through, and we're seeing a continued compression of downstream profit margins there. So let's take it to the property sector here, the real estate sector. Real estate, we don't know exactly how much it is as a percentage of GDP, but it could be as much as 20%, so it's pretty important. And it has been a major driver of Chinese growth here. This first slide is kind of dramatic. I'll point out that actually, if we look at just the non-seasonally adjusted month-on-month numbers for prices in the 70 city gauge, we're actually only looking at a few months of minimal declines. But if you seasonally adjust that and recognize that these data in slide 25 are also annualized, if we seasonally adjust that, it's actually quite a significant weakening. And with the data released today, that's down to 13% negative 13% for Beijing there. Again, coming back to the Fed and policy normalization, we've already seen this up creep in mortgage rates. We don't have great mortgage data, but we can model it from just the relationship between 10-year yields, government yields in China, and historical data that is published with quite a significant lag. And we can see that there is this kind of inverse relationship, as you'd expect, between borrowing and interest rates, mortgage rates, and prices. So we've started to see this cooling here, and we would expect that to continue down, and the rise in interest rates that we've seen is really only a drop in the bucket compared to what we're expecting over the next, externally at least, over the next 18 months. So getting the same message here from monetary data as well. That's a good leading indicator of prices in China, property prices and property price growth in China. And we're getting the same message there. Again, if we turn to the production data, production of cement has continued to be depressed. If we look at starts, that has also been depressed, even as property prices were booming in this period up here. We didn't see a big pickup in starts. It was more about drawing down inventory in the first tier and second tier cities. So the property sector is not looking in a great way. There has been a modest pickup in starts recently, the growth of home starts recently in the past couple of months. But as the Fed kind of gets back onto that tightening cycle, or continues with that tightening cycle, I should say, then we don't expect that the rebound in starts to continue, if you could call it a rebound at this stage. So there are some bright spots. I'm often criticized for being overly gloomy, but there are plenty of bright spots in the Chinese economy. Notably, the motor vehicle production continues to be a pocket of strength. And as I said, the Caixin manufacturing and the official manufacturing PMIs are very strong there. That doesn't sit very easily with the weakening of domestic demand and also the weakening of exports in real terms, which sort of makes me think that there's some degree of inventory buildup going on here, but there isn't really the data to follow that in any systematic way. Those bright spots notwithstanding, we are looking here at a downtrend in kind of our weighted average of industrial production and services that is not quite in keeping with the minimal uptick that we saw in GDP growth quarter on quarter on the expenditure approach that I took above in the previously in the presentation. And as I said, I think that's probably because nominal GDP growth doesn't pick up enough of the services sector. So that's where we see growth at the moment, and the kind of the why is basically because there's been this ongoing drive to deleverage the old guard industry that is sucking resources out of the rest of the economy. So a lot of the time when you see people talking about producer price inflation and how it's a good thing for deleveraging of these economies, of these companies, well, that's kind of true, but a lot of these companies just really oughtn't to be deleveraged. It's going to take 10 years or more, judging by the Japanese standard. And if you remember back to the beginning of the chart, China's debt has taken far less time to build up to the state that we see at this stage, and that probably means that bad debt is higher than it was in Japan, as Japan entered its period of deleveraging in the mid-90s. So that deleveraging drive has been behind the slowing of growth since about 2014, when a lot of these companies tried to improve their financial balances, and some of them moved into surplus based on the listed data. So what's the response going to be in the context of this Fed normalization that we're seeing? Well, here's our sort of dashboard of what the PBOC is doing and what they're watching. We've got the renminbi here. Obviously, they had to get back in the game a little bit after having not intervened for quite some time, or at least over 2017. They didn't intervene very much, and then we saw this rally in the renminbi that was driven a lot by kind of geopolitical tensions and kind of questions over the Fed path. And in the beginning of September, we think the authorities did actually get in and just nudge the currency down, but based actually a lot on the tension or the increase in stress that we saw in the interbank market. We've got the interest rate corridor here. the stress that we saw in the interbank market, it seems likely that actually the capital outflows did start to pick up again towards the end of September, and that probably continued into October. For September as a whole, though, we actually see that there was a very modest capital outflow by historical standards, or at least by the standards of the past few years. As I mentioned, also we've got this continue the squeezing of the balloon. You squeeze it in one place, you squeeze this guy, and then this guy rebounds. So that's another problem that the PBOC is facing, that they've highlighted at the party congress as well. What are the tools that they have to address these problems? Well, they have a whole array of tools, but actually in the context of weak growth that we've seen in the past, well, over the course of 2017, let's talk about 2017 at least, they've been quite restrained in terms of the net injections that they put into the market. That's picked up a little bit in October, and that's only to be expected in the context of the party congress. They don't want anything going wrong at this stage, and you can see that also from the reverse repo injections there as well. So we can see how they have behaved up to this point has actually been quite restrained, and that they wanted to allow growth to slow somewhat, and that probably will continue. That intention to allow growth to run slow will continue into 2018, but the Fed normalization is going to entail either that they have to allow the renminbi to fall by allowing capital to leave China and in search of those higher yields, or they have to allow domestic interest rates to rise further. And that, in the context of what we said before about how the distortions caused by Chinese excess savings have now been created within China, the excess of debt and the inability to service deficits without with interest rates at more normal levels, then that implies to us that the increase in Fed interest rates, China, the PBOC will be reticent and probably won't be able to continue to follow the Fed up in its own interest rates with its own interest rate corridor here. What we saw in the past two of the past three Fed hikes was that they weren't able to continue in June and to follow the Fed's policy hike in June with one of their own. And we think that they probably will, instead of allowing interest rates to normalize within China, they will probably allow the renminbi to depreciate over the next 18 months. Now, if there's any questions at this stage, then I'm happy to take those. I realize we've also had a lot of political events in Japan over the weekend, so if there's any questions on that, then please feel free to type away. And if not, then please get back to us on email or Bloomberg or however you like. So we'll catch any questions that come at this stage, and if not, then we'll round it up here. Okay, so please feel free to get back to us by any means, and thank you very much for your time here and taking the time to share these thoughts with us. Thank you. Bye.